Have you ever wondered what goes on in a man's mind when he seems distant even though he is present? How many times do we look at someone close to us, a father, a brother, a friend, a partner, and feel that something is wrong, but we can't identify what? In Jungian psychology, silent male suffering is like an iceberg. What we see on the surface is only a fraction of what actually exists in the depths of the psyche. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, devoted much of his work to understanding how men process their emotions and how society shapes this emotional expression. According to Jung, when a man suffers in silence, he is not just hiding his pain, he is fighting an internal battle with his shadow, with wounded masculine archetypes, and with deep-rooted social expectations. In this video, we'll explore the subtle but telling signs that a man is experiencing an emotional storm on the inside, even as he appears calm on the outside. Understanding these signs isn't just a matter of psychological curiosity. It's a key step toward building deeper relationships, promoting male mental health, and breaking the cycle of silent suffering that affects so many men in our society. Are you ready to dive into the world of male vulnerability through the lens of Jungian psychology? Let's discover together the signs that Carl Jung would certainly recognize as manifestations of a deep and unexpressed pain. 1. The deafening silence. The silence of a suffering man is not just the absence of words, it is a palpable, dense, suffocating presence. Jung would identify this silence as a manifestation of the shadow archetype, that part of the psyche that stores everything that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. When a man is suffering deeply, his silence becomes an impenetrable fortress. He responds with monosyllables. Conversations that once flowed naturally now feel like painful extractions. The pauses between words lengthen like chasms. This is not the contemplative silence of the wise, but the suffocating silence of one who carries an invisible weight. It is a silence that screams. You notice when you ask questions about how he is doing and receive automatic answers, empty of real meaning. I'm fine, nothing much, just tired. These are the shield phrases, designed not to communicate, but to shut down any possibility of true communication. The man in silent suffering develops an almost visceral aversion to conversations about emotions. When the subject approaches vulnerable territories, he abruptly changes the subject, turns up the volume of the television, suddenly remembers urgent tasks. These are not coincidences. They are defense mechanisms orchestrated by the unconscious to protect exposed wounds. Jung would observe that this silence is particularly telling in moments that would normally provoke emotion. When good news is met with a nod rather than celebration, when family tragedies are met with robotic stoicism, when personal achievements are downplayed, these are the moments when the deafening silence becomes most evident. Digital communication also reveals this pattern. Messages read and not answered, calls that go to voicemail, emails that receive short, practical responses devoid of any human warmth. In today's hyper-connected world, this digital silence is just as revealing as physical silence. What makes this silence particularly treacherous is its ability to camouflage itself as normality. Our culture already expects men to be less communicative about feelings, so this pathological silence often goes unnoticed, confused with the stereotype of the man of few words. But there is a qualitative difference that the attentive can perceive. It is a silence charged with tension, not peace. For Jung, this silence represents a break in the connection between the conscious and the unconscious. It is as if man is trying to silence not only his external voice, but also the internal dialogue with parts of himself that are suffering. The more he tries to stifle these inner voices, the more they gain power in the dark realm of the unconscious, eventually manifesting themselves through other psychic alarm signals. 2. Daily masks. The persona, a fundamental concept in Jungian psychology, is the face we present to the world, our social mask. For the man in silent suffering, this mask is not just a social interface, but a complete armor. He becomes a consummate actor, playing the role of the functional man with a precision that deceives even those closest to him. Jung would call this persona hypertrophy, when the social mask grows so large that it begins to stifle the true self. Notice the stark contrast between public and private behaviors. At work, he can be the exemplary employee, the respected leader, the good-natured colleague. At social gatherings, he holds superficial conversations with studied ease. He may even be the class clown, using humor as a smokescreen to hide the pain. But when the doors close and he is alone, the mask falls, revealing a face exhausted by the constant performance. This behavioral inconsistency is a classic sign. The man who seems perfectly fine in one context but completely disconnected in another is often wearing masks as a survival mechanism. It's not hypocrisy, it's psychic fragmentation. Jung would understand this as a dissociation between the public persona and the authentic self, a division that consumes massive psychic energy to maintain. The masks are also manifested in contradictory body language. Words that say, "I'm fine," accompanied by slumped shoulders, smiles that don't reach the eyes, laughter that sounds slightly out of tune, like an out-of-tune musical note. The body, as Jung well knew, often reveals what the conscious mind tries to hide. Particularly telling is the moment of the changing of masks, that fleeting instant when a man thinks no one is watching, and the facial expression changes completely. It is like watching a momentary transformation, a glimpse of the reality behind the carefully maintained illusion. You can notice this when he believes he's alone, when he thinks no one is paying attention, or in the seconds before he answers a phone call. The constant use of these masks takes a severe psychological toll. Jung would observe that the more time a man spends disconnected from his true self, the deeper his suffering becomes. The psychic energy required to maintain this constant performance depletes your internal resources, leaving you empty and exhausted. It's like acting in an endless play, never being able to leave the stage. In intimate relationships, these masks create an invisible distance. Even lying next to someone he loves, the man who suffers silently can feel completely alone, unable to let his guard down and show his true face. This superficial intimacy is particularly painful because it feels like a real connection, but it lacks the authenticity that truly nourishes the soul. The cruel paradox is that the more perfect the mask, the less likely it is that man will get the help he needs. Your competence in feigning well-being becomes your greatest obstacle to healing. 3. Rising shadow. The shadow, in Jungian's conception, is not just a poetic metaphor, it is a real psychic force, a repository of everything we deny in ourselves. For the man in silent suffering, this shadow expands like an oil slick in clear water, gradually contaminating areas of life that once brought pleasure and meaning. Jung would warn, the more we deny our pain, the more powerful it becomes in the shadows of the psyche. The first sign of this growing shadow is the emergence of behaviors apparently unconnected with the usual personality of man. The patient becomes impatient. The generous becomes stingy, the reliable becomes erratic. These are not random personality changes. They are manifestations of the shadow emerging when it can no longer be contained. They are repressed parts of the self that burst into consciousness, often at the most inopportune moments. Observe man's relationship with his own defects. When the shadow grows, tolerance decreases, not only with oneself, but especially with others. Jung would note, projection as a key mechanism. Man begins to see intensely in others what he cannot accept in himself. He becomes hypercritical of precisely the behaviors that reflect his own internal suffering. He hates the weakness in others because he fears his own vulnerability. He criticizes the indecision of others because he is internally paralyzed. Particularly telling is the development of intense and seemingly irrational aversions. The man with increasing shadow may develop a sudden hatred for activities, people, or places that were previously neutral or even pleasurable. These aversions often have symbolic connections to their inner pain. They avoid parks because it was there that they last felt genuine happiness. He distances himself from certain friends because they knew him before, when he did not yet carry this invisible burden. Dreams become more intense, more disturbing. Jung would pay special attention to this aspect, the unconscious communicating through dream images, what the conscious mind refuses to process. Recurring nightmares, shadowy figures chasing, feelings of falling or suffocating. These are the cries of the psyche asking for attention to the denied suffering. The man may not report these dreams, but the signs of disturbed sleep will be there. Dark circles under his eyes, startled awakening, resistance to going to bed. The relationship with time is also transformed. The growing shadow distorts the perception of time. The past becomes idealized or demonized, rarely seen clearly. The future appears as a gray extension of the present, devoid of hope or possibilities. The present is experienced as something to be endured, not lived. This temporal distortion is particularly evident in language. Notice how the suffering man talks about enduring or surviving the day rather than living it. Rituals of subtle self-destruction emerge, not necessarily dramatically self-destructive behaviors, but small acts of personal sabotage, deliberately sleeping less than necessary, neglecting basic needs, procrastinate on important matters, sabotage opportunities for improvement. The shadow, as Jung would explain, seeks expression even if it is through continued suffering. Synchronicity, another fundamental Jungian concept, manifests itself in disturbing ways. Man begins to notice patterns, meaningful coincidences that seem to reflect his internal state. These are not random projections, but the psyche seeking integration through external reality when blocked internally. 4. Voluntary isolation. The social withdrawal of a suffering man is not a mere coincidence. It is a deliberate, albeit unconscious, psychic strategy. Jung would recognize this isolation as a primitive attempt at self-preservation. When the internal world is in chaos, reducing external stimulation becomes imperative. It is like an injured animal that retreats to a cave, not out of desire, but out of instinctive need for protection. This insulation follows a distinct pattern. It starts subtly, refusals to invitations that would previously have been accepted without hesitation. "I'm busy" becomes the automatic response. Observe the body language during these moments. The averted gaze, the closed posture, the smartphone that appears as a shield against interaction. It's not just social fatigue, it's a strategic retreat from an emotional battlefield for which he no longer has the resources. Particularly telling is the pattern of absent presence. Man is physically present at family or social gatherings, but psychically absent. Your body takes up space, but your mind is somewhere else. Conversations happen around him, not with him. Questions need to be repeated. Answers come late, as if traveling great distances to arrive. This subtle dissociation is a defense mechanism that Jung would recognize as an attempt to preserve psychic energy when internal resources are dangerously low. Technology often becomes both a tool and a symptom of this isolation. Games, series, aimless browsing on the internet. Activities that create the illusion of connection while keeping the real world at a safe distance. It is not the use of technology itself that signals the problem, but the compulsive, anesthetic quality of this use. It's a modern form of dissociation that Jung would surely recognize as an attempt to temporarily escape from painful consciousness. Physical space becomes an extension of this psychic isolation. The man in silent suffering creates fortresses, spaces where he can be alone, whether it is an office with a locked door, a garage turned into a refuge, or simply the parked car where he remains seated long after he arrives home. These are not just physical spaces, but external representations of a psychic state, buffer zones between your tumultuous inner world and the demands of the outer world. Paradoxically, this man can simultaneously fear and desire connection. Jung would understand this ambivalence as a reflection of the internal battle between different aspects of the psyche, the fundamental human desire for belonging fighting against the fear of being truly seen in a state of vulnerability. This tension manifests itself in contradictory behaviors, seeking companionship only to create distance when it is offered. Isolation also affects the relationship with one's own body. Physical activities that were once pleasurable are abandoned. The sensory connection with the world diminishes. Food loses flavor. Music loses emotional impact. Physical touch becomes uncomfortable. Jung would see this as a somatic manifestation of psychic dissociation. When the mind disconnects from parts of itself, the body reflects this fragmentation. This isolation is particularly painful because it often occurs in plain sight. Man can be surrounded by people, family, colleagues, friends, and still inhabit a private emotional desert. It is possible to feel completely alone in a crowded room, and this loneliness in the midst of a crowd is perhaps the most painful of all. 5. Anger displaced. Anger in the man who suffers silently is not just an emotion, it is a substitute, language, a ciphered code for pains that do not find direct expression. Jung would understand this anger as transformed psychic energy. When sadness, fear, or shame are culturally unacceptable to the masculine, these emotions do not disappear. They metamorphose into fury, the only emotion that the archetype of the wounded warrior allows himself to express openly. Note the pattern of disproportionality, the explosion by a spilled glass, the fit of rage by a traffic sign, the heated discussion about politics with strangers on the internet. These are not reactions to the immediate stimulus. They are pressure valves for an overworked emotional system. The intensity of the response reveals not the importance of the trigger, but the volume of repressed emotion seeking escape. It's like using a cannon to kill a fly. Exaggeration of the response is the signal. Particularly telling is the target of this anger. Jung would note that it is rarely directed to the true source of suffering. Instead, it finds substitute objects, often those safer, closer, less capable of retaliation. The boss humiliates, but it is the wife who receives the explosion. Rejection hurts, but it is the child who endures impatience. Professional failure corrodes, but it is the stranger in traffic who faces the furious horn. This transfer is not calculated. It is an unconscious mechanism of protection against even more painful vulnerabilities. The quality of this anger has distinctive characteristics. It is sudden, like lightning in a clear sky. It is intense, mobilizing the entire body in seconds. And crucially, it's often followed by periods of disproportionate shame or remorse. Another sign that the emotion expressed wasn't the underlying, authentic emotion. This cycle of explosion, remorse, repression, explosion is a classic pattern that Jung would recognize as failed attempts at emotional integration. Body language during these episodes reveals the truth behind the mask. Notice the clenched fists even. When words are controlled, the jaw tense during seemingly casual conversations, shallow breathing in situations of moderate stress. The body expresses the truth that the conscious mind tries to hide. It is prepared for battle even when there is no real enemy in sight. Particularly significant is self-directed anger, manifested as relentless self-criticism, punitive perfectionism, intolerance of one's own mistakes, deliberate self-sabotage. Jung would see this as the shadow turned inward. When the external expression is blocked, the psychic energy returns as an attack on the self. This self-harm is often masked as high standards or self-discipline, but its destructive quality distinguishes it from true self-development. The relationship with physical objects also changes. Doors slam harder. Objects are handled roughly. Technology that fails can be broken rather than fixed. These are not just outbursts of temper. They are symbolic expressions of a psyche that has lost the ability to process complex emotions. In an integrated way, the material world becomes the stage for an internal drama that does not find adequate expression. Humor is also transformed, acquiring a caustic, cynical quality. Jokes that were once light become biting, loaded with disguised hostility. Sarcasm becomes the default form of communication. Jung would recognize this as expression of the shadow through socially acceptable channels. Anger disguised as humor is still anger, just dressed for dinner. This misplaced anger is particularly insidious because it creates a cycle of self-feeding isolation. The more a man expresses inappropriate anger, the more people turn away, confirming his unconscious belief that he is alone in his suffering. Defense itself becomes the cause of more pain, in a downward spiral that Jung would recognize as the classical neurotic pattern. 6. Emotional anesthesia. The effective blunting in the man who suffers silently is not just the absence of emotion, it is a strategy of psychic survival. Jung would identify this phenomenon as a form of protective dissociation. When emotional pain becomes unbearable, the psyche erects walls not only against suffering, but against the entire emotional landscape. It's like shutting down the entire electrical system in the house because one circuit is overloaded. This dullness manifests itself first in the moments that should provoke joy. Notice the flat response to good news, the mechanical smile in front of gifts, the celebration of birthdays or achievements as obligations to be fulfilled, not experiences to be savored. It's not ingratitude, it's a genuine inability to access positive emotions when the entire emotional system is in protection mode. Jung would call this the constriction of the feeling function, a defense mechanism that sacrifices vitality in the name of survival. Particularly telling is the response to previously significant memories. Photos of happy moments are observed with clinical detachment. Songs that once provoked emotion are heard as mere background noise. Places loaded with personal meaning are visited without emotional resonance. This disconnection from one's own emotional history is a classic sign that Jung would recognize as fragmentation of psychic continuity. Man can no longer integrate who he was with who he is. Language reflects this anesthesia. Emotional vocabulary atrophies. Ask how you feel, and the answers gravitate to neutral territory, normal. Okay, no big deal. It is not deliberate evasion, it is genuine poverty of emotional language, a reflection of an internal world that has lost its colors and nuances. Jung would note that when pressed to elaborate, this man often resorts to physical descriptions. Tired, with a headache, rather than emotional states, the body becomes the only vocabulary available. The relationship with basic pleasures also transforms. Food becomes fuel, not a source of pleasure. Sex becomes mechanical, disconnected from emotional intimacy. Hobbies that were once pleasurable are abandoned or maintained by mere inertia. This anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, is not laziness or ingratitude, but a symptom of a nervous system in energy conservation mode, prioritizing basic survival functions over hedonic experiences. Particularly significant is the response to tragedies or crises. The emotionally anesthetized man often functions with astonishing efficiency in emergencies, not because he is exceptionally courageous, but because he is already operating in the same dissociative state that others attain only in crisis. This competence at critical moments often reinforces the mask of strength, further obscuring the underlying suffering. The relationship with art and beauty also deteriorates. Moving films no longer move. Music becomes background noise. Stunning landscapes are recorded, not experienced. Jung would understand this as atrophy of aesthetic function. When the psyche is overloaded with unprocessed pain, the responsiveness to beauty decreases as beauty and pain access the same emotional channels. This emotional anesthesia is also manifested in the decrease in empathy, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. The man who has blocked access to his own emotions inevitably loses the ability to resonate with the emotions of others. As Jung would observe, the unrecognized shadow in oneself becomes invisible. In others, creating a double isolation from one's own internal world and from the shared emotional experience that underlies authentic human connections. The most insidious aspect of this anesthesia is its self-reinforcing quality. The more time a man spends disconnected from his emotions, the more his emotion-regulating abilities atrophy, making the prospect of reopening these channels even more threatening. It's like an immobilized limb that loses muscle mass. The protection itself makes recovery more difficult. 7. Unconscious search. Behind the silent male suffering, Jung would identify a powerful and paradoxical force, the unconscious search for healing. This is not a conscious, planned, or even recognized pursuit. It is the instinctive movement of the psyche toward wholeness, even as the conscious mind resists. Like water that inevitably finds its way through the hardest rock, the need for psychic integration manifests itself in patterns that, seen with Jungian eyes, reveal a profound call to transformation. Notice the seemingly inexplicable attraction to certain books, movies, or music. The man who has never shown interest in spirituality suddenly finds himself attracted to philosophical texts. The pragmatic executive who starts collecting abstract art. The rational engineer who develops a fascination with mythology. These are not random coincidences. They are manifestations of what Jung would call synchronicity, the psyche looking to the external world for symbols that can give shape to inarticulate internal suffering. It is as if the unconscious is trying to communicate through metaphors when direct language has been blocked. Particularly revealing are the new interests that contrast sharply with the established personality. The traditionally logical man who develops a sudden interest in poetry, the competitive athlete who begins to meditate, the workaholic who is inexplicably attracted to gardening. Jung would recognize these as attempts by the psyche to balance itself, to integrate neglected aspects of the self. They are expressions of transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to create unifying symbols that can build bridges between consciousness and unconscious. Dreams become especially significant at this stage. Even if man does not consciously report or remember them, their influence can be observed. Recurring themes emerge in casual conversations. Dream images infiltrate seemingly rational decisions. Jung would give special attention to dreams about water, oceans, rivers, floods. Classic symbols of the unconscious seeking recognition. or dreams of archetypal figures, the wise old man, the child, the wounded warrior, symbolic representations of aspects of the self-seeking integration. The relationship with time is also subtly transformed. The unconscious seeking man often develops an interest in his own roots, family genealogy, cultural history, ancestral traditions. At the same time, there may be concern about legacy, about what it will leave for the future. This two-dimensional movement in time, backward to origins and forward to legacy, reflects what Jung would call the process of individuation, the psyche attempting to establish meaningful continuity beyond the limits of individual existence. Accidental encounters with people that provoke intense emotional reactions also characterize this phase. Man finds unexpected mentors. He forms friendships with people who challenge his worldview. He feels inexplicably attracted or repelled by certain individuals. Jung would recognize these as projections, unrecognized aspects of the self being perceived first in others, an unconscious mechanism for making visible what cannot yet be confronted internally. Creativity often emerges in unexpected ways. The man who has never written starts a diary. The pragmatic executive experiments with painting on weekends. The structural engineer develops an interest in music. These are not just random hobbies. They are channels for symbolic expression, attempts by the psyche to process through non-verbal language what remains inexpressible in direct words. Jung would especially value these creative expressions as manifestations of the transcendent function in action. Personal rituals develop spontaneously, lonely walks at specific times, compulsive reorganization of personal spaces, elaborate morning routines. These are not just habits, they are unconscious rituals, attempts to create external order when the internal world is in chaos. Jung would recognize in these behavioral patterns the search for symbolic containment, the creation of alchemical vessels where psychic transformation can safely occur. Particularly significant is the attraction to symbols of transformation. The unconscious seeker is often drawn to narratives of death and rebirth, whether in movies, books, or mythology. He develops a fascination for metamorphosis processes in nature. He is touched by stories of redemption and second chances. These are not random aesthetic preferences. They are the psyche seeking maps for its own journey of transformation. This unconscious search is perhaps the most hopeful aspect of silent male suffering. Even when the conscious mind resists healing, the innate wisdom of the psyche continues to work behind the scenes, creating opportunities for integration and growth. As Jung would state, the psyche has self-regulating capacity. It naturally seeks balance, even when the conscious ego clings to dysfunctional patterns. To recognize these signs of unconscious seeking is to recognize that even in the deepest suffering, there is a movement toward wholeness. It's not naive optimism. It's recognition of the wisdom inherent in the human psyche, its relentless pursuit of integration even in the most adverse circumstances. For Jung, this would be the true male heroic journey, not the stoic denial of pain, but the courage to follow the signs that the unconscious offers, trusting in the process of transformation even without being able to clearly see the final destination.